Hello, my name is Trivio Fodder, and I am the program manager of the Indigenous Governance Program at the Native Nations Institute. And I'm very pleased to be here with Del Laverdure, former acting Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, founding partner of the Arrow Creek Law Firm, um, has extensive experience throughout the arc of his career in intergovernmental relations, uh, working with tribes as counsel, and many other hats that he's worn throughout his career. Dell, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you, Tori. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, as we kind of begin this conversation for folks, one of the things that I just kind of want to open up. I mean, you've had a wealth of experience at multiple levels, throughout your career. Obviously, at the federal level, state, local government. We've talked separately about partnership and working with people that don't necessarily share your point of view. And I'm just wondering, obviously in this day and age, what do you think are some of the pressing issues that are facing Indian country today? Just open up broadly.
Yeah. There's a wide variety of things that I think as tribes have increased capacity, deploying their resources internally and externally, and then really in the kind of post-pandemic world, I would say a lot of things were revealed during the pandemic that are major issues that maybe weren't, that didn't come to light at the time. And by those, I
Hmm.
mean public health in Indian country. There's only two agencies that's on the federal level that serve the health, and it's the military and Indian Affairs, and you have Indian Health Service, and then the lack of mental and behavioral health support, uh, psychosocial support, and revealing that the mental health needs that are there, all of those came to light, I think, in an exponential way. And then really, how much sovereignty do tribes have, and can they exercise without immediate conflict and challenges to what they do? And for example, was up in South Dakota when they did checkpoints, and the governor of South Dakota wanted all the highways and reservations open for business because commerce was more important. Um, there was a battle over that. There were, um, I think, telemedicine because
Yeah.
a lot of tribes are in very rural areas. How were they going to get the support they needed during the pandemic when we know isolation and loneliness is one of the huge problems for society at large, and then for Indian country as well? And so I think you started to see for the first time, this collective sense of we really needed to invest in the public health infrastructure, information, education, and then deployment of those services. And sometimes tribes were leading the way, whether it was delivery of COVID vaccines or blocking off and isolating to prevent the virus from spreading. And so I think you saw a novel part in our whole tripartite system that tribes play a very important role in many communities, and they are a regional hub for a lot of communities that are near them as well.
For for the tribes that were in those situations to be influential, I mean, do you think that that affected their tribal state relations in any way? I mean, did it like I'm thinking about in terms of like the state, because so often, at least as we paint the picture in academia, it's like the state is skeptical of the tribe's ability to deliver services, to provide for citizens. Do you think that in those states there was kind of a meaningful shift in the needle in terms of state tribal perception?
Yeah, I mean, I think It would depend on where you're talking about. And just to give some concrete examples, one would be here in Arizona with the Gila River Indian community. I remember the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, in conjunction with NNI, had did a number of policy papers looking at who was delivering what, how were the tribes playing a role in the larger system. And in Arizona, I think there was some vaccine hesitancy.
Mm.
They wanted commerce still to be open, and Gila River saw a number of community members dying, and they took a public health and a sovereign position to start to close its borders. But at the same time, as soon as the vaccine became available, they started delivering to all the non-Indian neighbors, and residents of Phoenix came over to them to receive the safe, potentially life-saving vaccines and a return to life in general. So you saw tribal leadership out of the entire state, actually, when it became available. And just that trust from the outside community that may not have existed at that level before, that now they saw the tribal leadership and how helpful it could be. And, in a different context, up in the Rocky Mountain and Plains region, when tribes said they had to shut down because there was no 6 feet distancing, that was not even a possibility, that was a wiser choice for them and their communities in those very rural areas. And the tribes took the leadership up there. And the states may not have agreed per se, but at least in Montana's case, they deferred to the tribes and supported their decision. In South Dakota, there was a conflict. But what you saw was a rise in tribal leadership in response to the needs of their community, and then other governments reacting to them for the first time instead of the vice versa.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting reversal of roles, I think, because so often the criticism, historically against tribal sovereignty and self government is that there's this somehow innate lack of capacity or ability to do it, to govern, to do things effectively. And what you're saying in terms of like the COVID response, I mean, just in the examples that you cited, I mean, it's the exact opposite. The tribe actually had its act together before the state.
Yeah, yes, and I think that in that case, it was about the leadership, and I think when you can rally around issues of safety, threat, and importance of life in a community, they showed not only the capacity but the leadership that was an example for everyone else around, and I think really did demonstrate how committed they are to trying to do the right thing, even under difficult circumstances and even when they're under resourced. But when you can focus them in on like a pandemic, you saw was a fast response to a quickly adapting issue that really information was coming in piecemeal and the science was following, and then they could make moves even quicker and maybe were more adaptable than some of the other governments.
Yeah. Well, where I want to go next with this conversation, I mean, I think it's directly related, but when you think about the myriad of issues that face Indian country today, what do you think are some of the most important internal issues that tribes have to deal with now? Because those shift over time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, at the core of a lot of tribal nations today is, the sense of citizenship, who is a citizen or not. The nomenclature historically was membership, but really looking at people as citizens of their governments, where they provide services and there's rights and responsibilities connected to that. I think who being a citizen going forward is going to have growing importance. And how do you capture those that have been part of a community and maybe have ancestral connections to? Are they still citizens of those communities? And how do you continue to deliver services which require the resources when you see a lot of this population growth? Because Indian country is fairly young as a whole, And having a younger population, I think having their identity secure in who they are and where they come from and who they want to serve, if they go out and get educated and want to return home, is a really critical issue for all tribal governments across the board. And there's I think this issue of healing and restoration of culture is key because of historic legacies around not only allotting and taking of tribal lands, but also then taking of tribal children, generations of them, placing them in schools to take away their culture and identity and language. And then how do you restore that after multiple generations of that has happened? So I think trauma informed recovery efforts for land, language, the culture, and then the identity. That goes to the very core of who each of the tribal citizens, knows who they are, where they come from, and they can say that in the historic language in places that are safe to express who they are in their own way, and then continue that on for the generations in the future. Those will continue to be critical and important issues on defining how tribal governments evolve and adapt as we go over time.
Identity is so important. And one of the big issues is that there are some tribes that have been tempted to adjust what identity means through the whole disenrollment and adjusting the blood quantum process for tribal identification. It's a very tempting thing to do because as tribes develop themselves more economically, there's a bigger economic pie, and there's a very strong temptation to say, okay, well, if there's a big pie and there are fewer people, then let's go that route. Um, so thinking about it that way, I mean, what's your sense of the trend?
Yeah, I mean, you can approach this from a lot of different perspectives. And I think, there are a lot of thorny issues, legal and political, cultural, surrounding all of this. And,
Sure.
I think if we come back to kind of who we are as a people in each of those communities and for them to decide, but that ultimately, at least having some semblance of a human rights kind of understanding of, some basic things like the right to be, become, and belong are really fundamental to and shape who a person is. And when you start adjusting that based on priorities or values that may have shifted as a result of increased resources or increased capacities, I just wonder, what perspective are they coming from? Because I think those fundamental things, are really inclusive types of things that you don't adjust lightly. That there has to be significant community discussion, input, and really
Hmm.
understanding its impacts, not only on those who came before you, but those who come after. And I always think of all of those things in a capacity of, we are the dreams of our ancestors and we are the memories of our descendants. And if we see that
Hmm.
long line of connection, it becomes more difficult to exclude than include.
If we drill down into that a little bit, it's really about community at the end of the day, and those people to make their own decisions, because it can't be prescriptive, right? I mean, you don't need Washington D.C. or some other entity telling a tribe how to decide who belongs. But I think what's interesting about what you said is you link it. It's not just about the piece of the pie that someone would get. But it's actually about the tie to community and the people that have gone on and the folks that are yet to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think it involves some fundamental questions about who a person is, who a family is, and who a community is in relation to each other.
Yeah.
And when you view it from this interconnected kind of web of networks, you see the connections more than if you isolate and exclude. And if people can have that perspective when they're making those decisions, I think it becomes more difficult to exclude an immediacy of the moment for whatever might make sense, in with a limited set of factors, than when looking at it very holistically around how do we relate to each other, how do we relate to ourselves, and then how do we relate in community. And that actually is the hallmark of what distinguishes, I think, tribal nations from all other governments, is we are a web of family networks that have survived and trying to find a way to thrive. And as long as we remember who we are and make decisions from that 7 generation perspective, then I think things will continue, and they can prosper.
Well, and that's kind of actually a very interesting segue into the next question I had for you. All of this is kind of subsumed within kind of a broader spiritual question about existence and belonging. But one of the big issues today, I mean, it gets the Twitter hashtags and the TikTok reels and whatnot, but is the notion of land back, and part of that land back movement is premised upon the idea that Native peoples have a spiritual and meaningful long-term connection with land. And I'm wondering if you can just comment or share any of your own thoughts or reflections on this, because I mean it's been kind of in the mill for a bit now, and some tribes have actually had a great deal of success in restoring some of their lands to the tribal body corpus. So just curious, your own thoughts and reactions, because I mean it is an important issue, certainly for a lot of young people that are very interested in this particular issue. So just curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, humanity is the youngest of the beings that have come to live in community after all the other beings, including the animals, plants, wildlife, the elements, and then Earth as a base in the solar system. But land is central in the middle to a lot of identities. It's where a lot of origin stories of indigenous people talk about the land and the water and the creator breathing life and having humans come forward, and that some of the charges in life and responsibilities were to communicate for all the others who couldn't communicate. And so it's an important and effective way of staying in relation to all other things. And so when the land and the language is restored or preserved, then you have ceremonies around places that involve different generations of people. And so when people can still remember, the stories connected to the land, there's a part of us that exists in it. And most tribal nations, to my knowledge, refer to, the earth as Mother Earth. And that's part of what people, I think, understand or have some kind of connection to. But if there's a story about all of it for the people in certain areas, then there's just a multi-generational connection to a place. And I don't mean just an ordinary farm or a ranch, and that can even be special in the non-native context for them, and it can shape generations of lives. But imagine that going on for hundreds and if not thousands of years. And when you start to understand the land in that kind of space-time dimension continuum, you realize how it's interwoven with the people who are originally from there, and that the connection, the depth is unparalleled. So when you return land, that's why there's a celebration. When you return bison, when the salmon come back, when the plants come back, it's a restoration of wholeness for the people in that community. So I think that's why land it's central to who they are as a people, their histories, and their relation to everything. And if it's just treated as a commodity, then it's really disconnected from that whole kind of literature of place, which I think is much more comprehensive in its understanding.
It's a very different way of thinking about lands, and the temptation of American legal theory to look at land as property. And I think that for a number of people that'll be difficult for them to wrap their minds around, just the distinction, because we're not talking about land as property or something you own. This is my 20 acres and here's my fence, and I've got my papers and my deed and land and title description, but it's about connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Connection, place, and
Yeah.
that we're only here for so long, and we only use it for so long.
Yeah.
And as long as they take care of it and remember why it's there, then you get the gift of life continuing in that long line of thinking and perspective to keep using it for the purpose that maybe that community has been using it for.
Yeah.
And then there are connections, and then sometimes there are sacred sites or places that are special of gathering, hunting, fishing, gathering that they've done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And those things are connecting in families and with communities, and it's a way of life.
Well, and this kind of opens up, I think, the next place I'd like to take our conversation. Each tribe has its own connection and relationship to land, but I think what we've seen over the years, at least in terms of the legal canon, is that there are often instances where tribes can benefit from working together. And I'm wondering, in your experience, having seen a lot of the foibles or the successes, if you can talk a little bit about to the extent to which it's important for tribes to have intertribal, intergovernmental relations among themselves, and what are some of those pressing issues that you see coming up today?
Yeah, I think effective intertribal organizations amplify messages, and if there are issues of common concern, can really flag them in their advocacy efforts to either stop something, to start something, to minimize the impacts of something. And you have a spectrum, a vast spectrum of examples that, in particular regions, there are groups of intertribal organizations that can be really effective in their messaging and communication. I mean, you have, say, in the regions around, let's just say the U.S., have Alaska Natives in the villages up there that have issues around climate change and subsistence. And when they unify around an issue, it alerts the federal government and congressional leaders to the importance of movement and fixing, adapting according to the circumstances, and preserving the rights that they've had. You've got the Native Hawaiians who are, fighting for recognition and have a long history there of the overthrow of the kingdom and trying to restore their own rights and over the land and the culture, and in a way that's consistent for them historically. You got the Southwest down here where you have the Arizona Intertribal Organization, and when they can speak effectively in Nevada, and I happen to work with the Coalition of Large Tribes, which is a lot of the Southwest and then the Rocky Mountain and Plains region, and they come together on issues of common concern and work in a consensus way. And then when they flag it, because there are, say, 7 or 8 states involved, that becomes a bigger issue that people are forced to reckon with. And
sorry, at the state level or at the federal level?
It can be state, regional, and national level, but oftentimes they're flagged at the national level to find the resources or attention to focus on an issue to resolve the conflict or the issue. And sometimes it's benign neglect by federal agencies, and other times they're long-standing, simmering issues that really need a solution to a complicated, complex set of problems. And it forces more consultation and meaningful consultation, forces more effective government-to-government relationships, and a real mutuality and trust responsibility. The more you can have speaking to an issue, the more impact it'll carry. So, it's, you have the Native American Rights Fund, who's been monitoring with the Supreme Court project and done a wonderful job. NCAI, was creating reaction determination and helped to end it over the years. And you have regional intertribal organizations that I think have become really effective in their areas. And, the tribes in a particular region then oftentimes have parallel or similar concerns, but they're not always identical. So it leaves room for them to advocate on their own behalves. But there have been very effective. I think intertribal organizations can be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, and that I think sort of leads us to the kind of last question I wanted to make sure we covered. As you think about Native nations today, what are some of the challenges that are most pressing in the current political environment? And I frame it that way because we take it for granted that plenary power of Congress over Indian affairs is still a thing, and tribes have to operate within this sort of imposed legal structure. So, from your perspective, having been a public servant as an attorney now, what do you think some of the challenges are that tribes need to be mindful of or even wary of as we kind of move forward into the next decade or so?
Yeah, I think it would depend on which context we're discussing, but in the judicial, especially federal judicial context, there's always concerns about what the U.S. Supreme Court is going to interpret. And since federal Indian law is federal common law, they have a lot of impact with each of their decisions. There's been a couple of favorable ones, but there's also been negative ones. And I think there's going to always be a need for tribes to work together to minimize which cases go up and in which context. And it's often said bad facts make bad law, so you got to watch for the ones that are coming from a difficult posture, and that are going to be an uphill battle to convince federal judges, who by and large are not Native. There are a few, and overcoming their entire lifetime experiences, education, and understanding is really difficult to do. There are a lot of more and more effective Indian law advocates out there, and I'm glad about that. And I used to hear the stories when I was in starting law school about Back in 1969, there were 5 Indian lawyers out there, and now there's many thousands, and that's a good positive development. That's one, the challenge of making sure everyone has good and effective representation, even those who don't have the resources, because the ones with the resources do, but we need to make sure the ones that don't also have that, because it impacts everybody. That's what happens with common law. I think in terms of the governance context, if there was some way to kind of structurally protect tribes, especially with the budgets, one of the things I've seen that's been pressing but has been a real challenge is having tribes in the mandatory bucket of funding because of treaties and the history that's happened. They're in the discretionary side of the federal budget. And so every time there's a changeover in administrations and if there's budget cutting measures, they're on the chopping block. Mm-hmm. And it's scary for a lot of communities because if the federal dollars aren't there to meet the federal requirements and responsibilities of what they agreed to for the land cessions, then there's just a drastic cut in services. And connecting this to the first point, if we have a growing young population and the budget's not meeting it, and then you go into trimming down deficit reduction, Indian Affairs is always one of the first ones to feel the brunt of that. So having a mandatory piece to match the treaty responsibilities is absolutely critical. And that would help set a base. And then maybe plus up or minus depending on, what's happening in the world. I mean, COVID required a lot more resources that were unexpected. There might be other emergencies that come up, and is Indian country ready and have the capacity to meet that? And I think you saw with this pandemic era that there were some leadership, and then there also were a lot of community members that weren't ready for it and passed on. We lost a lot of elders with a lot of stories and language and history, and we can't get that back. We have to preserve the history and culture and document. And I would say, another pressing issue is just boarding schools and what's happened, and to remedy that, having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and document the history so it never happens again, and then address it with resources that are appropriately tailored to what people need for mental and behavioral health support, because they didn't create the trauma came to them. And now they're left with the aftermath of how do we deal with this without continuing, the cycles of problems that have occurred as a result of external forces coming in.
You mentioned the need to actually have kind of a permanent fund to fulfill the treaty obligations. Should leadership on that particular issue, should that come from the Congress or the executive?
Well, it has to be both, right? I mean, usually the president and his team and Office of Management and Budget pulls a suggested budget to Congress, then Congress decides whether it's going to follow it or cut or add. So you need both to understand and say, no, we need this all to be mandatory. It belongs with the military and these other huge commitments like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. That's where Indian Affairs should be. And that they shouldn't be on the chopping block whenever there's fight about, too much money's out there and we need to cut and deficits. These are permanent obligations that their ancestors took with our ancestors, and it needs to be met. It's not discretionary. And once we understand that, we have a base to work from, and then we don't have to always be worried whenever there's another crisis about the budget not being able to get through.
Well, and I don't mean to harp too much on this, but maybe you can explain, given your experience, discretionary spending versus spending that's ironclad and committed, like the defense budget or military spending. Because I'd wager a lot of folks that might watch don't know or get the difference.
Yeah, I mean, in in terms of the larger federal budget, there is the side that they call mandatory funding, and it has defense, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and those have been permanently set aside as mandatory. And then all the other 26 federal agencies and anything else we do, including military support, wartime support, are all on the discretionary side. The mandatory side of the budget is much bigger than the discretionary side. And Indian Affairs is only in the base of it is only in two federal agencies in the discretionary side: Indian Health Service under Health and Human Services, and it's 4 point whatever billion now. And then in the U.S. Department of Interior has Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Indian Education at roughly 2.9 billion. Those are the two base discretionary funds, and they're really very small compared to the rest of the discretionary budget, and especially compared to the mandatory budget. But they're the original promises that even preceded all the rest.
Mm.
And that's why I think they belong in the other side of the mandatory ledger. I mean, I think legally and politically they should be there.
Yeah.
And it just has not been well understood, like you were saying.
So, I mean, part of it's timing, but the bulk of the argument is origins. These are promises that have been extant for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, starting from the very first treaties of before the U.S. Constitution, and 371 federally ratified later, and a bunch of unratified ones, all point to this is what they said they were going to do when the lands were ceded or just taken.
Yeah.
And so that's what comprises those budgets.
We will see what progress Congress makes. As we kind of close out, I just want to open it up. Any parting thoughts? Anything you want to share? Given the arc of your career, and obviously we appreciate you as a friend of the program, as a faculty member. A lot of respect for you and the work that you do.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I just really appreciate the fact that this program and that they work with professionals and staff who every day this is what they deal with. They live through it, experience it, and they need training as well and updates and to share their experiences so that they can move up or be confident or switch to what is needed for them. So I believe in the overall mission. I think a lot of that cross collaboration probably needs to continue and grow, expand. And I think it should be worldwide for Indigenous people. I've run into more and more over the years, not just through this program, through other programs, and we have a lot to learn from each other. And the larger nation states treat Indigenous people differently. And there are a lot of learning lessons there. And I think even though the tribes in the U.S. are seen in a leadership kind of role, we have a lot to learn too. We have a lot of practical sovereignty, I like to say. Then there are places where they've adjusted and adapted and created their own way of life that's protected, and it may not look like ours, but it may be helpful for various communities. And if they are each to decide for themselves, the more information, the more experience that's provided and laid out and shared cross-culturally and cross-Indigenous, I think would continue to be helpful for people, and they can take what works and leave what doesn't, and be very practical about it.
Dill, thank you so much. It's been a good time, and really appreciate your insights and all the time you've invested in the program, obviously educating those younger generations, but also the time you took here today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Tori, and thanks to IGP and NNI. Really enjoyed being part of it.